Good evening. So I spent a lot of time today thinking about how I'm going to introduce this reading, but instead of thinking too hard about it, I went down to the river and watched whole trees drift towards the dam. But I was really thinking about Nogales, Sonora, where with the support of the Jerome Foundation, I went this past August to do some research on migration. And I remember vividly a scene there. When we were sitting in the central square of Nogales, I was speaking to a recently deported migrant. And they're deporting around 350 people a day, sending them over a bridge without their papers, without their backpacks, often in cities far from where they cross the border, and many of whom aren't Mexican. And we were sitting in the plaza, and behind us was a massive sort of structure that looks a lot like those 1970s riot-proof buildings made of poured concrete, about 3 stories tall, that hangs over the border wall, which is another 10 to 15 feet of steel. And you could see all of the pleasant people moving between cities with shopping bags full, but the plaza was full of recent deported migrants sitting around with nothing to do. And as we were sitting there chatting, a train began to pull out of the city, and the train just pulls out maybe 100 yards from the central park there. It's more of a cement pavilion, but closest thing to a park, I guess. And the train pulls out, and the gates open up, and everyone's eyes turn to the train, and watch it leave. But none of these people, unlike me, could leave, stuck in a limbo, sent to a limbo. And I was thinking about that today as I looked at the river, watching the river move, over-flooded, over-full. And I just wanted to share that with you tonight. I'll be reading from my forthcoming novel, maybe, an excerpt somewhere in the middle. When they came for us, I was at the bay, kneeling before a fire in the white sand, boiling tar. My oldest son, Gruye, was in the cold morning surf, digging out sea turtle eggs and putting them in a plastic shopping bag to sell at St. Town Market. Gruye had Angela's features, fine-boned and lithe with a high forehead and large eyes. As I fanned the fire, I watched him work alongside the other boys, the long necklace of his baby teeth swaying with his motion, passing over a birthmark on his chest, just above his heart, and beneath the pronounced bones of his collar, making him seem younger than he was. He would soon be old enough to accompany me out to sea. The idea was suddenly satisfying, as if, unknowingly, fatherhood was a series of unfinished movements that are made complete by circumstances beyond your control. For a moment, I felt the beach lean beneath me and shudder, and I assumed it was another tremor. They had been occurring more frequently, and we had heard some news about an earthquake in the capital. Then I saw the pickup trucks rushing toward us from the south, across the beach, men with clothing wound over their faces and grinning children in fatigues hanging from the truck side waving machetes. Before I realized what was happening, the big guns mounted in the back of the trucks began to open up, sizzling, and I watched in horror as the bullets slammed the surf, shredding the boys like putty. And at that moment, I would have ran to Gruye. God, I was screaming to run to Gruye, ears ringing. But Bug tackled me and pulled me down behind the boat, and I bit into his hand until my mouth was filled with blood, and the image of Gruye's corpse slowly rocking in the bloody surf filled my vision like a searing light. As I think back to that moment, I realize what was really holding my attention, strangely, was not Gruye's murder, but how entire memories that for years had been lost deep in my mind suddenly flashed before my eyes. I saw where Angela and I first lived after Gruye's birth, in the banana forest, the brick walls of the shack saturated with the smell of cedar lumber. And before we moved in, we had to kill scorpions and rats for a whole afternoon. Angela would stand outside the door with a machete. A thin tank top wrapped around her head as I moved the lumber out of the window for hours, flushing rats into the doorway where Angela would kill them with one whack of the machete. But more often she wounded them, and the rats thrashed and tried to drag their paralyzed bodies into the shade of the overgrown grasses beside the building. We washed the dirt with bucketfuls of lake water, even though it didn't relieve Angela's worry about snakes. Once the dirt dried in the afternoon sun, we dragged the mattress outside, and all three of us slept on the mattress underneath a half-finished zinc awning, where he could see the stars beyond the shaggy treetops, the fireflies staggered in reflection on top of the grasses, with Gruye between us unmoving, as small as a jackfruit and soft as butter. In the morning, tiny hard-backed insects the size of pinheads descended in masses to sit on our faces, our arms, all exposed flesh, and crawl slowly in no direction. And we swatted and turned, trying to steal a few more moments of sleep before the heat set in. But it didn't work. My hands sweating on Angela's shifting naked body. We swatted and turned, and Gruye began to cry, moaning softly. And Angela got up with him in her arms and sat in the lawn chair to breastfeed while I covered my head with a single sheet, surreptitiously watching her feed Gruye, her long, slender calves folded beneath her, her swollen breasts between her arms, and her almond eyes, unblinking, set on the blazing horizon like a night watchman. I slowly lay back down, turning, till it was too hot to bear, with Angela taunting me, and the morning sunlight low and intense filtering through the thin sheet. I reluctantly sat up on the mattress, demanding my coffee, acting as if we were an old married couple, even though I secretly prayed we would never grow old, that would be permitted to live like this, unchanging, for the rest of eternity, knowing as I prayed that it was an impossible thing to wish for, that if nothing else, life would begin to accelerate, to burn away as we slept. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered. And I continued to lie to myself. Well, Angela told me to go make my own coffee, lazy ass, ignoring the fact we never had coffee in those days, only illusion of coffee, the illusion of eternity, and the deep, cool shade of our fantasy. The second night, we started to hear the cats. It woke me suddenly, but Angela had already been awake, her head turned toward the dark smear of the banana plantation that spread south for acres at the edge of the cleared lot. The sound of toads in the lake shallows gathered around us like drummed gut, incessant and seamless, as if the toads were held in thrall to their own ability to produce sound. Their chanting was broken only by the wheeling, mournful howl of a pack of feral cats in the banana plantation. I put my hand on Angela's bare shoulder, and she reached up, putting her hand in mine. And I could feel the sweat in her cool palms, and I knew she was afraid. That horrible sound raced towards us from the darkness, sounding unmistakably like the name of our son, Gruye. 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 From midnight onward, the cat out there, riding above the demonic murmur of her companions, whinnying out Gruye's name. Angela and I barely slept the rest of the night, silent, but our senses were acute to any movement in the grass, errant shapes loping across the banana plantation. And we saw as the insects came in the morning light like a fog to lie down among us. In the morning, we didn't have to talk about what we heard. There was nothing to talk about except Angela's dream, but she didn't want to tell me what she saw. Instead, we busied ourselves in the morning cool, preparing the shack for us to move in that evening, to at least get behind a door, even though we both knew it'd be hot and uncomfortable, but both of us were made more uncomfortable by the extent of our vulnerability while asleep. The idea of jungle cats silently harming our empty bodies. Using the lumber we moved out the day before, I spent the morning making a crib for our son. It took longer than I expected, in part because I assumed it would be easy, and the finished product, although sturdy, was crooked and formed of hunks of cedar that I had cut with the machete. And Angela told me it was perfect for a monster child. I could tell she was disappointed, but she didn't say anything more. She had been quiet and impatient all morning, probably due to her lack of sleep, and the burden of toting Gruye around latched to her breast like a giant parasite. I hoped my terrible carpentry didn't prompt her to think of other inadequacies I may have. I knew she cared more about me than to think my inability to make a square crib was somehow a reflection of my cowardliness, even though, soon, she would witness me at my most humiliated, but all this was to come later. In the afternoon, partly to make up for Angela's disappointment, I went to Greenhouse Bay to fish, where the old house was falling into itself in an orchard of lime trees, timbers scavenged, and I became so carried away I didn't return home until after dark, delayed in part by a turtle who had twisted and fought his way into a knot of netting that I had to untangle. When I returned home, the fireflies were already dancing in the grasses, and Angela was sitting with Gruye in the lawn chair beneath a shadow box of firelight from the kerosene lamp falling all around her, reflecting off the zinc roofing. She didn't say anything to me. I knew she didn't like to be left alone after dark, anywhere, ever since Eden, and I tried to kiss her, but she stood away from me and put sleeping Gruye into his new crib that she had lined with our only pillow and new sheets. So I knew she had been to town, but Gruye looked comfortable enough, dwarfed by the massive crib sides. When she came out, she had the machete and she went to the nearest banana tree to gather leaves. I left her and went to the cooking fire, where she had a small pan filled with boiling water, and on the ledge of the firebox, a plastic bag of instant coffee. After I made the coffee, I went around the back of the shack, suddenly hypnotized by a hunger for swivel, and I found a gallon jug of corn swivel I had hidden beneath some bricks in a hole in the ground. I sat there and drank my coffee, taking shots from the swiggle jug every so often until I felt a little lightheaded, and stupidly, made confident by the swivel, I came around the house carrying my jug and sat in the lawn chair to watch Angela butcher the turtle. She saw me, and surprisingly, instead of going inside the shack and locking the door, she asked me for a bump. It wasn't long before we were both drunk. I gathered coals from the cooking fire, and using coconut shells and cedar scraps, I made a bonfire at the edge of the banana forest, and Angela abandoned her work with the turtle, still covered in slop from the turtle's fatty membrane, and she suddenly suggested that we undress and dance like savages, she said, snarling facetiously. And startled by her behavior, I didn't believe she was serious. All she wore was a thin dress, wet from her efforts with the turtle. She stared at me with an expression that I will not forget again. She looked as if she had suddenly realized the world was upside down, and it bothered her that she hadn't noticed it before, a look both bemused and frustrated. Then she did something strange, something unlike her. She was always so conscious of hygiene. She ran her wet fingertips up her thighs and across her breasts, smearing blood over her body in dark streaks, fingertip marks on her cheeks. And I was surprised at my sudden apprehension, because I no longer recognized her, a creature of night. And, as if in response to her strange behavior, I was overwhelmed by an almost instant arousal, seeing her that way in the firelight, the curve of her bones beneath her flesh, and the human night bristling above her. It occurred to me then that this moment had been brought into existence the day I first made love to Angela, or maybe even before then. And it had only been waiting for us through the years like a patient host. There was no turning back. We danced that way in the wash of flames from the bonfire, the world spinning beneath us, and we were the night as we melted into each other, waxy and fluid in a forest of thumbs. When I woke, it was still night. The fire had burned down to embers scattered near our feet, or my feet, because when I woke, I realized Angela was gone, but not far. When I rolled over to my stomach, I saw her crouching outside the open door of the shack, her taut pose instantly alarming, her gaze fixed on the darkness within, with the machete held above her. Suddenly, I was in a panic. This wasn't right, and I pushed myself from the dirt and ran into the shack, passing Angela, who hissed at me in warning, my feet unsteady on the pebbles of the shack floor. And as my eyes adjusted, I saw the large cat on top of Gruye asleep in the crib, an apparition born from the heat and the night and our blood. The cat turned toward me. I could see the hollow amber light in her eyes, and she silently opened her jaws, her striped, shaggy head the size of a lung. And as I reached in to take Gruye from her, she attacked my arms, her fangs sinking deep into my flesh, and I cried out in pain. Angela was there, and as I pulled Gruye from the crib, she swung the machete down and knocked the cat back with a dull thud. And then, as much as I am humiliated by my reaction, I ran. I ran from that room as Angela hacked into the screaming cat. I ran with Gruye in my arms, the air coming in big, hungry gulps, my heart blown through the roof of my head, pulsing out before me in the darkness, a painful screeching in my ears. I could feel something charging up behind me, getting closer, closer, its hot breath in my ears, screaming my name. I ran away blindly into the jungle wall, thrashing my way through the overgrowth until I stubbed my knee into a rock. And tumbling forward through the night, I landed abruptly, my head staved on another broken rock. And in the flash of pain, I could hear its childlike voice, whoever or whatever it was. Feel its hot weight on me, its dry tongue lapping at my ear, along my throat, suffocating me. And before I lost consciousness, for a brief moment, I saw vapors tumble and sift, cloud-like, over the surface of a steely river. Thank you.